This is Beyond Belief Sobriety, a podcast and community for people who are seeking or who have found a secular path to recovery from addictions of all kinds. Hello, thank you for spending your time listening to our podcast. I hope you find it helpful and that this adds a little something extra to your stockpile of recovery capital. I met my guest for this episode a few years ago at a meeting of the We Agnostics AA group in Kansas City, Missouri. I always admired her for her self-confidence, her thoughtfulness, and her independent spirit, so it was a real treat for me to sit down with her and get to know her better. I hope you liked the conversation as much as I did. I learned a lot from her. But before we get started, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, SoberLink. If you're seeking a tangible way to maintain accountability and prove sobriety to loved ones, you have to try SoberLink. If you haven't heard of SoberLink, they've created a remote alcohol monitoring system that revolutionizes the way people document sobriety. The system includes a breathalyzer and uses artificial intelligence to display your test results in a calendar format, helping you analyze your habits and prove to yourself and others that you are, in fact, not drinking. It even has real-time results, facial recognition, and tamper detection so no one will question the validity of your results. SoberLink and I have created a guide called 5 Tools and Strategies for Those on a Secular Path to Recovery that you can find at soberlink.com/BBS. So if you're ready to take the next step in your recovery journey, mention the Beyond Belief Sobriety podcast when ordering SoberLink, and you'll receive $50 off their device. And now, episode 271, Embrace the Truth.
I left the church in 2003 officially and procedurally because I gave back my credential, but that didn't happen overnight. And it happened primarily because I had at that time shifted from what, I would say were the core beliefs of Christianity, that Jesus saves us humans from sin. So after several years of really contemplating that, or more than several, then I decided to walk away from ordained ministry as a pastor, mainly because I did not believe that, and therefore I didn't want to call others to believe what I wasn't willing to believe. So I wasn't, at first it wasn't about atheism at all. It was simply just a movement away from traditional Christianity. And then it became that later as I continued to dig into my own belief system and, again, the philosophies that I was willing to hold on to or let go of at that time.
And you grew up in Illinois.
I did.
Springfield, Illinois?
In Springfield, Illinois, a little small town. Well, I'd call it a small town, but it is the capital of Illinois.
Right.
Not Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I am familiar with that area, and that whole part of Illinois is pretty rural when you get outside of Springfield, isn't it?
It is. That's southern, like south central Illinois. I was only about 80 miles, or Springfield's only about 80 miles from St. Louis. So we went to St. Louis a lot more than we went to Chicago as a family. And it's once you move away from the cities, in Illinois or in any place for that matter, you get out into the hinterlands, as we urbanists would say. Yes.
So let's go ahead and get into your story.
Okay. Yeah. Whenever people ask me about my story, I'm like, what part? Where should I begin? Oh my goodness. Because I did grow up in Springfield, and I had really a decent childhood, I'd call it that. My parents gave us the best that they could give. Both of my parents were working, great jobs, that allowed them to provide for us. So I grew up what would be considered very Black middle class. We lived in neighborhoods, not the suburb. I wouldn't say Springfield's a place that had a whole lot of suburbs. A suburb for me would be a place outside of the city or around the city, like where I live in another city. Like here in Kansas City, there's Olathe, there's Overland Park. Those are actual cities. And those are what, again, we urbanists, urban planners would consider as suburban areas around an urban area. So I didn't grow up in the suburbs. I grew up in the neighborhoods that were growing in the city, more middle-class neighborhoods, mostly predominantly white, to be truthful. And then I grew up Catholic, born and raised Catholic, and went to Catholic high schools all the way, K through 12. I was a student at a Catholic schools, and also Catholicism was my family's practicing religion, or it's what we practiced as a family. So that was, that was what I grew up in. But I mean, my parents also divorced. So I did experience the breakup of their marriage as a child, adolescent. And that was probably one of the greatest factors that led to my choice in a college and where I wanted to go to college. I wanted to get far away from my family. I mean, that was what was in my head at that time. So I wanted to go away, move away from kind of the pain of that. And I did that. I went to Atlanta, Georgia. Yeah, so I went to undergrad at Clark Atlanta University, which is an historically Black college, which, was a huge difference from what I had grown up in terms of institutionally, right? At school, day to day, surrounded by many Black youth like myself. That was new for me because I grew up in an environment where I was not surrounded by many Black youth. I was actually surrounded by many white youth and white authorities. Yeah. Clark Atlanta was great. I enjoyed it totally. Actually, I became the first Miss Clark Atlanta. So,
I saw that.
Yeah, I was a homecoming queen, which is a big deal. I mean, if any of your listeners watch like Beyonce's Homecoming, that documentary is the way that it kind of is, right?
Well, okay.
Yeah, in terms of what homecoming is at an HBCU. It is a major event, and I had the opportunity to be the first Miss Clark Atlanta because Atlanta University, which was a graduate institution, merged with Clark College. So when I went to school, it was Clark College. And anyhow, so that's the experience I had. I also was and is, I am a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, which is a very significant organization of Black women, college educated. I think that actually DST, I'm saying it for short, is open to all women, actually, but primarily it's going to be Black women who are members and who all of the, they call them the Divine Nine, all of the Black sororities or Black Greek letter organizations were established before the Great Depression, except one. And that is a major, major piece of information to say how Black women and men who were college educated at that time were, working on their own social organization, thinking about the networks that they could develop and they should be developing, especially in a world that was really racially discriminatory against them. That's a kind word for it. But at that time, they would have been experiencing in the 20s and 30s, they would have been experiencing some of the greatest racial hatred that we have witnessed in our country's short tenure. So anyway, yeah, it was a huge accomplishment. And I saw the way that the women on my campus, Clark Atlanta, were conducting themselves, and I was excited to, if you will, apply to be one of them. And being a part of Delta Sigma Theta it was at that time, pretty arduous. You pledged, so you were on a line with other women, and I was on a line with 19 other women, and we kind of lived and breathed together for quite a few months before we became members. We initiated, as it is. But anyway, so that was, I was on the road at that time to getting a degree in political science, which I did. But my first endeavor in terms of my education was to go to law school. So when I was at Clark Atlanta, I was interested in, I wanted to finish my degree in my bachelor's in political science, but that's because I was interested in becoming an attorney one day. And so that was a major factor in my work at that time. And actually, I did go to law school. I just didn't continue. You don't see that very prominently. If you do Google me, you'll see other degrees. But I did enter law school after several years and after my first master's and working a bit for a couple of state governments. I did go to law school briefly in Houston, Texas at Thurgood Marshall School of Law, another HBCU. Wow. Yes. So Thurgood Marshall School was phenomenal. I enjoyed it totally. But that is where I entered like ministry, right? The really local church ministry. I got active with a large suburban Black church there, United Methodist. By then I had already switched, made a significant step toward being a Protestant versus being a Catholic.
Yeah, that was a big move. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do that. Like at the end of my high school years, I was very aware that I was very disenchanted with Catholicism. So becoming Protestant wasn't a stretch for me. It was like, okay, I'm ready to do this. Which
so really, from a young
actually,
age, you were pretty thoughtful about your beliefs, weren't you?
That's really who I am. I'm very curious. I was a bookworm. I spent a lot of time in libraries because my mother is an educator. So I would, I would take the bus sometimes after school to go to the library at the institution where she worked, and I would wait for her. I would, to go home with her, but I would be in the library, and that was my thing, being in the library and being alone with my thoughts and exploring other people's thoughts. That is a big part of who I am even today.
So it sounds like for so far at this point, man, your life is just going pretty smooth. It seems like you're a pretty confident young woman, and you're just following the path to have a career.
Well, yeah, smooth it sounds good. It sounds kind of picturesque, right? However, in any family, there's always the ups and downs. And so, like I mentioned, my parents did divorce, so we experienced that as a family. And emotionally, yeah, I also was, dealing with that. But yeah, I had been able to move into adulthood with a lot of great opportunities. I would say that, I enjoyed being a student, right? Again, obviously I'm a professor now, but I enjoyed learning, and it is a thing I love to do even today, to learn new things and encourage others to learn, motivate them to learn. That's a big part of my life. So, yeah. When I was in Houston, Texas, it was there that I was active in a United Methodist church with a pretty famous pastor at the time, Kirby John Caldwell. If any of your listeners are, listen from Texas, they'll know who he is or was. He was a pastor of a very large Black United Methodist church in the now that wasn't in the suburbs of Houston, but I became active, and this is where things really began to shift for me, with a local church in the downtown or central business district of Houston that was just getting off the ground. And what it was like a satellite church of Kirby John Caldwell's. Windsor Village was the name of Kirby John Caldwell's church. But they started did a startup of a community, a church, even where they weren't so big on calling it a United Methodist church. But they appointed 2 local church pastors to kind of work with Kirby John, or they came out of Windsor Village to primarily serve those who lived on the streets in Houston, Texas. And that was wonderful for me. I got very, very active in it. I mean, I was a part of the ministry there. I led the hospital ministry. I was coordinating that with other members who were also active in ministry. I eventually started teaching Bible study, huge Bible studies that would meet on Saturdays. I preached, I did it all there, all that you would do as a minister. And so that consumed me. And I was in law school at the time, which I also enjoyed thoroughly. Again, I was always a good student. And so what happened was it consumed me so much, that ministry consumed me, and I loved it. And I thought it was just amazing. It really, I was like on fire. I would go to halfway houses with my Bible and conduct Bible studies. I would just be doing all of these things in the name of my faith at the time. And also in the name of service, because all of these things, that I've been mentioning, the work that I was doing, the work that I wanted to do in my adult life was really about serving others. And so being a part of, and that was St. John's Community Church. Actually, it's the church now that Beyonce affiliated herself with. They have two dynamic pastors. I believe they're both still pastoring the church there, Rudy and Juanita Rasmus, husband and wife team. It was just phenomenal. And I was just on fire for that. And I left Houston kind of unexpectedly when it was clear that, even though, I love doing it, but I was like, I gotta go. I gotta do the next thing. And Houston didn't seem to be offering except for that ministry. Moved back to Illinois. I was working all these different places, in and out of working, I should say. I became active with a residential school for children with developmental disabilities, loved the work there, but also active with the church in Illinois. And I started on the track to a professional, or what you call vocational ordained ministry, through the United Methodist Church by way of Springfield, Illinois. So I was back home. And of course, that led to another move, which was a seminary, and that was here in Kansas City. Mm-hmm. So that brought me to Kansas City in the 90s as a candidate for ordained ministry in the United Methodist Church.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And did you stay in Kansas City after you got out of the school?
No. I pastored here, and I was appointed my last couple of years of seminary to pastor, even though I was living here. So I was traveling back and forth for about a year and a half to Marshall. If you know where Marshall,
Missouri.
Marshall, Missouri. They talk about rural parts. Yes. So I was going back and forth from Marshall to Kansas City. I have family in Missouri. Both my parents have roots in Missouri. So that was kind of familiar territory for me. And also, I didn't say that after I left Clark Atlanta, I went to the University of Missouri. So I got a master's in public administration from there before I went to law school. So Missouri was very familiar to me. So no, I didn't stay because, at that time I was like, I'm moving up in the United Methodist Church. And I took a charge or an appointment in Illinois at the University of Illinois. That's how I ended up there. I was pastoring there. And it was there that I pastored with two other clergy persons at that point. In Marshall and Slater, I had my own churches. And those churches were part of what was the legacy of the segregated church, racially segregated in the United Methodist Church. Because United Methodism is different from, say, African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the break, where the break off happened in the, I want to say I can't remember the establishment of the AME Church. I want to say it was even perhaps the late 19th century, but the AME Church and the United Methodist Church were, they're both Methodists, but they were racially very different. And then those who stayed, the Blacks who were part of the United Methodist Church also experienced a very racially segregated situation. So when I took the charge in Marshall, those two churches were formerly of the colored section of the United Methodist Church.
Interesting.
Yeah, even the United Methodist Church is having its own issues today with other splits, right, around sexual orientation and what have you. So anyway, so when I went to the University of Missouri, I mean, I loved it. I was pastoring. I was doing all the things that a pastor does, including writing sermons, giving sermons, hospital visitations, chaplain type ministry, work with people, just being, being a pastor is like being a civic leader. I mean, you live somewhat very visible. Well, you live a visible life, you live in that fishbowl, right? So I could say, that part of my life was really, I was really aware of how much responsibility I had. I was aware of how many eyes were on me and everything, but I was kind of like, okay with that. I hadn't done anything in my life that I needed to be ashamed of, or like I didn't need to be there. So that was a big part of it. Yeah. So I was a part of that church, but in being there and also having had at that point the benefit of getting a Master of Divinity along the way from St. Paul's School of Theology here in Kansas City, I had time to work through a lot of my own theological beliefs. And I went on leave after a year there. I had my own kind of disheartening moments at that particular congregation with two of my colleagues at that time. I wasn't really happy with that. So I took that time to assess what I wanted to do from there. Because I knew theologically I was already kind of on the fringe, meaning at that point, I knew that I didn't believe in Jesus as a savior, as a personal savior. I also didn't believe, I had let go of this idea of sin.
Okay,
right?
interesting. But not necessarily an atheist.
Oh, no.
But just in that theological, I guess, points.
Yeah, in that theological world, I had enough information at that time that I had set aside. See, I was born and raised Catholic, so Catholics believe in what? Original sin, the idea of original sin. And I grew up with that. And that always did cause me some problems and think, okay, wait a minute, we're saying through no fault of our own, just by being born, we're sinful. Okay. And so as I continued to learn more about that, it just disintegrated, that idea. I respect what we humans have done to try to make sense of ourselves and our world. But that was an idea, a belief that I let go of pretty much after I was at Illinois, but I was already on my way there with that, with not believing in original sin, not believing in the idea of Jesus as therefore, if there's no original sin, there's no sin to be saved from, then, I was like, well, what is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Not that I discount the figure if he actually lived, but I saw him at that time as a revolutionary figure, a more prophetic figure, someone who challenged the structures of his time and was assassinated for doing that, right? And lost his life as a result. That I believe is the fate of many who will challenge the powerful structures, principalities, powers of their time, even to this day. So that experience, which I was on leave for a little while, I went to Massachusetts because I also picked up another master's while I was at the University of Illinois in urban planning, which is another profession that's really about serving the public. Again, I was drawn to it for that reason. And then I went to the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I was on leave the last couple of years. I was in Champaign-Urbana, all the while in school. And also I was teaching at Parkland Community College. I started teaching, my formal teaching career started there. Even though I was previously, a graduate assistant and I was doing teaching and research for professors, I do mark my experience at Parkland Community College as my first formal teaching, experience. So anyway, but then I moved to Massachusetts to pursue the PhD finally. And I would say, even when I was in seminary, I had a professor who was like, the world needs you, but he said, we need you in academia. And I just want to really encourage you to go on for the PhD. And I tell you, I was like, no, I'm tired. I'm done. I've had enough education. Don't you think that 3 masters, or 2 masters at that time was enough? And lo and behold, picked up 1 more master's along the way. And then I ended up at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I was working on my PhD. So I finished it there, but a lot happened there too. Oh my gosh. That's what I'm saying. I feel like I'd be talking forever to truly share it all. But really my engagement with academic institutions has been central to my life and to shaping who I am today.
Yeah, and you've contributed a lot to the public with everything that you've written and what you've learned. Even the work that I read, I learned a lot, but I've never read about anything like that before, so I never really had given it any thought. So tell me, during this time, was substance abuse ever an issue, or was there any kind of problematic behaviors that you were kind of dealing with at the time?
Well, yes and no. Okay, so in terms of alcohol in college, I was pretty much straight and narrow. However, I had boyfriends who liked to drink a whole heck of a lot when I was in undergrad. Drinking wasn't a big thing for me in undergrad, but it was for the men that I chose. So I saw it that way. As a matter of fact, I remember leaving a relationship because I felt like he was drinking too much, and it was affecting our relationship. I didn't begin to drink excessively until, I was in Massachusetts. So that's where alcohol became more of a constant in my life, used it for more than just 1 or 2 glasses, I think that, just and mainly to cope with the stress of being a PhD student, right? I think that's where it began to kind of balloon, right? That's where I began to see my heaviest drinking, and by then I was in my 30s, so I had moved through my early adulthood, I would call that. Into more, those solid years, that prime of your life and what have you. So I think at that time too, I felt like, well, I can handle this, it's just, it's something I can handle. I never saw it as, at that time, I didn't admit it, and that's part of alcoholism, right? You want to deny that you actually are, you have a problem and that, you're overdoing it, and this could be very, very harmful eventually if not addressed. So, but because I thought about that earlier. I probably thought about that once I really began to think in terms of sobriety, of how much alcohol was a part of the men's lives that I knew. It was the Black men who I was involved with. They used alcohol or they used some other thing. So I define addiction not simply as, an addiction to alcohol. People are addicted to a lot of things, but any behavior that a person uses to escape from maybe pain or memories, and they can't, stop. It's compulsive. Any behavior that could be sex. And I would say that sex was definitely a part of a lot of the men's lives that I was involved with. I didn't feel like I was needed to have sex in order to feel better, but I know that the men that I was with did, a lot of them. So at that point, I began to see myself drink more. Later, that became an issue, much later even than that, because I wasn't willing to say, well, I'm not in a good place with it. I thought it was just, something I could get a hold of. And it may have been. It's just that I didn't. I continued to come home, to a glass or two or three of wine, every night. And anyway, so that's where it really began to shift for me. Yeah. But also I had many other shifts at that time, right? I had left the church. I left the church procedurally in 2003. And a big part of my pain at that time was really being able to find work, because I had devoted a decade to being this minister, right? And while, I knew how much of a leader I had become and how many administrative skills I had developed and how much I had even begun to write, writing became central to my life. And I mean, I was, aligned with people, on the national level, on state level. I started working for a state lawmaker who became a good friend of mine. In Springfield, Massachusetts. While I was in Massachusetts, I lived in Springfield. I lived in Holyoke. But I think all of that was just my way of trying to figure all of those changes out, yeah. But it wasn't until I came here to Kansas City, I moved back to Kansas City in 2015, that I realized I've got to do something about my use of alcohol, my abuse of it,
That might have been around the time that I met you, I wonder.
You met me, it had to be after 2017. So I had been here 2 years. I was teaching at University of Missouri, Kansas City. I was working with an institute there. I was doing a number of things. And I've had to juggle a lot of different jobs in my life because, like I said, because what happens is that while I see those things as important and again, administrative, I've had a hard time figuring out, how do I market all of this? How do I market it? And I mean, now I'm very comfortable with the fact that I'm multi-talented. I can do many things well, not just one thing. Whereas, you have some people, they have a job and they do that one thing for all of their lives, right? But, that's not me. I have been able to do many things. The thing that's most important right now, for example, is my writing, as well as my teaching. And so I spend the bulk of my energy focusing on that. And also, so when you met me, I decided I was going to get sober, so to speak, right? And sobriety for me does not mean abstinence. And so we've talked about that before. You and I met in the context of my dealing with, my sobriety, my face thing. I've got to be a recovering person.
Yes, I've come to understand. This is really interesting. I did a little solo episode that I put on YouTube last week. What is recovery? And I was going by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of Recovery. And nowhere in the definition does it mention abstinence or sobriety. What it talks about is a process of change through which we live a self-directed life and strive to live to our fullest potential, something along those lines. Improve our health and well-being, and through a process of change like that. So yeah. And I was talking to someone else the other day who has an online kind of a, I don't know, therapy type thing online where they're helping people on the spectrum of addiction. So it's a huge spectrum, and not does everybody have to have entire abstinence as their goal. And we were talking about that too. So it's a different way of thinking, for a lot of people who live in a black and white world where it's just either or.
Yeah. And I think you've said the key word there, key phrase, which is black and white world. Our world is not so black and white, not for me. And, when I initially started going to 12-step groups for, on the issue of alcohol, because I was also going to 12-step groups on the issue of codependency.
Yeah, you must have recognized that you were having all these relationships with guys for whom alcohol was important, right?
Yeah. And my number one compulsion still is, well, Well, I'm better because right, I've worked on it. It was codependency, and meaning that compulsive response that I've learned to have to fix, right, to try to control for what I felt was out of control, to try to please others, by changing myself and not being authentically who I am. So I was already working on that and doing better
within a 12-step environment.
In a 12-step program. And I still go to 12-step meetings for codependency as I go to 12-step meetings for alcoholism. Yeah. Because I think that I see myself as a recovering person. I could also probably think of other things that I need to recover from,
Isn't life itself something to recover from?
We all could. And one of the reasons that, you and I talked about my being on here and whether I was going to use my real name and all that stuff, one of the things that has to happen to break down the stigma of alcoholism or whatever isms there are is that we have to face it. We have to name it. We have to look head on. For those of us who are willing to be out, if you will, that is how it's going. That's one way of how the social environment is going to change when it comes to alcohol. For example, I don't like joke about alcohol with others or, make light of it because I know how dangerous it can be. I mean, thankfully, I never had a situation where it caused me great embarrassment. But I know many who have. I've also seen many of my ex-lovers or friends and current friends, as well as ex-friends, suffer tremendously because of the, of their addictions, especially with alcohol and other addictions too. But so I do think that if people are going to think any differently about these addictions and how we experience them or why we experience them, we have to begin to talk openly and honestly and name those things, right? We have to say there is recovery, there is help or hope. We can get beyond this. Like, I don't encourage people who are new to, if they want to abstain, then great. I don't discourage anybody from that. And I say, you got to find your process, what works for you, and if you know that you're a person who cannot stop yourself, okay, then yeah, maybe abstinence is the thing, because you have to think about, why can't I stop myself?
We're really fortunate in this day and age that there are a lot of different options for people too. There's medically assisted treatment for alcohol use disorder that's successful for a lot of people, depending on where you fall on the spectrum of the problem and so forth. And so, yeah, I've learned through some of the things that I've been doing recently is the first thing I think one needs to do if they're getting into recovery is ask themselves, what does it look like for me? What is my goal? What do I want? What do I want my life to look like? And there's a process you go through, and you can have people to help you and find your way.
Exactly. Because again, there are, one of my favorite teachers is Dr. Gabor Mate. Dr. Mate helped me to think through my own process, which was, he helped me to understand what addiction does to the body, right? And mainly to the brain, that addiction actually is something that has affected our brains, that a person who is suffering with addiction quite possibly suffered from some kind of trauma to where the inhibitors in their brain don't work properly, right? The endorphin system has been damaged, as well as, we get that hit of dopamine, when we're doing whatever it is we're doing to make us feel good. So anyway, he helped me to see that, hey, this is something that's happening in the brain. And people just believe, like Nancy Reagan and others, you can just say no. No, you really have to begin to heal the brain. And I really believe that. Where 12-step groups help, because that's just the first step. That's not treatment per se. But 12-step groups help in that it helps the person to get in a community of acceptance and compassion. And they begin to, do the rewiring that's necessary.
I'm glad you said that. It's so important, I think, for anyone to understand that any 12-step group or even non-12-step group, Smart Recovery, Life Ring, any of these peer support groups are not treatment. They're support. And there's a big difference between treatment and support.
Right. And I do, we just talking about process, some people need the treatment. Right. They need to go much further than just the support group. I mean, it's a great thing to have support. But for someone who has been drinking chronically, they really need more than just, a group around them that they're meeting with on, once. Well, I know most of the people that I know through AA are going to meetings at least 3 times a week, if not more, every day in some cases. Hey, I'm up for it too. I'm like encouraging, because again, to be a recovering person, you have to be willing to do the work, right? And anyway, so I became willing to do the work on myself, to listen to others, to learn, to change my behaviors, right? I'm a person, obviously, who doesn't have problem with change overall. All the changes I've been through in life.
Now, by the time that you got involved with 12 Steps, you at this point were identifying as an atheist.
Oh, yes. So in 2010, I left the church in 2003 officially. So it wasn't until 2010 that I was willing to call myself an atheist. Therefore, a person who I have absolutely no belief in gods or supernatural beings or others working on our behalf, right?
And you're quite open about that in all your writings and so forth. Everywhere
yes.
I see, you're open about that. You have no issue with that.
Yeah. And that's funny, because that's what I'm saying. Well, wait a minute now. I can't get on the show and not be open about recovery,
right.
Or hide who I am, because I have.
Well, there's almost a stigma to being an atheist in a way, isn't there?
It's a very big stigma. Like, it is the elephant in the room. I mean, because what do you do when, like, I've been at work in work settings, and I sneeze or something, whatever. And somebody's like, God bless you. And I'm looking at them, my eyes are like popping out of my head. Like, you don't have to say that to me, but, I appreciate the thought. But when the reason I tend to say something is because, number one, I'm not going to say it back. I'm like, if somebody's waiting on me to tell them, God bless you, you'd be waiting forever. And also, again, I don't order my world or my identity, my well-being on the idea of, a God taking care of it. And I don't like to promote that, because when I have to go along with that in settings, in public settings, it's uncomfortable for me, because that's really not who I am. And I don't want to just give the appearance of, being a believer in gods, plural, so that other people can feel comfortable, right? I try to live a very authentic life, which is what I did, when I left the local church ministry. That was a move toward greater authenticity, right? A move to embrace who I had become at that time. And the same is true for me now, who I have become as a recovering person from more than one addiction in life, has to do with embracing, again, who I am. But that's about power, right? Because I think that in all these addictions and all these things that we're doing in our lives to run away, we're running away from ourselves. We're just running away from who we are and what we went through. And we find power in embracing the truth about ourselves, it's where when we don't want to embrace the truth about who we are, what we came from, what we're part of, that we run into problems in life. And we also are disempowered that way.
Wow.
And
I think that is so true. I think so too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a big part. That was a big part of the process for me, was just understanding who I was. And I tell you what, it's been probably a lifelong process of becoming more and more, I guess, authentic to the world,
That's right.
So did you have any conflict with your atheism and the 12 steps, or how did you resolve that? Any conflict you had?
Oh, plenty of conflict. Meaning, yeah, because I think when you remember early in meeting you, we were going to the place over at All Souls.
Yep, All Souls Unitarian Universalist Church.
Unitarian Church. Okay, the Unitarian Church is probably closer to atheism than.
Yeah, I think they had an atheist minister.
Exactly. Now that's good, but it didn't mean that our meetings and the people who came there, because part of these 12 steps is not excluding people. So we'd have meetings where people come and they believe in the God, paradigm. During a meeting, you'd get on the one extreme, you'd get those who are like anti-theist, right? Like totally against any,
they want to burn the church down, basically.
Exactly. You get that. The Richard Dawkins types, You're like, and then on the other hand, you'd get the ones who come into the room, who believe that the only way you can be and live a sober life and be sober is with the help of a God. So yeah, I kind of lived in that, for a little bit until I found my groove, and finding my groove had to do with, there are people who are coming to these rooms who are like-minded, like yourself. I mean, I think the first time I really kind of addressed you in a meeting or whatever, and I know we don't always cross-talk in the meetings, but I was just almost in tears in realizing what you had done in even, establishing an agnostic group, and I knew from my own experience of establishing anything new, how hard that is. There's scholarship, yes, on the hatred people have toward atheists, being vitriolic, violent, and often because people have no clue as to what an atheist is. Yeah, so I experienced that some in that regard, but in my personal life, absolutely. In my personal life, I experienced it. I've no doubt in my mind that I haven't gotten jobs because people Googled me and found out I'm an atheist. Okay, bam. That's that. And that's that. They'll make up another reason as to why they can't hire me. But I felt like I've known when it's been because they learned that I was an atheist. And, with Black folks, oh my goodness, because it, unfortunately, in a very kind of stereotypical way, Black folks are considered to be inherently spiritual, or, I don't even use that term, so inherently religious. I understand totally why many Black people, African Americans and others who, have a connection to Caribbean or any group of people who's been the subject of colonialism and colonial activity. I understand that being able to project onto a higher power the love that, you want, or the love that you need, or the acceptance that's important, that becomes an important thing, right? It's like this higher power is going to take care of this. Again, like I said, I get it, especially in dire situations where, I can imagine what my ancestors who lived, 50 to 100 years ago here on this land, in this country, experienced day to day. So I understand why they deflected to a higher power, but also that wasn't all they did, right? Because there's certainly those who were African and becoming African American were doing to assert their humanity, to say this is who we are, to say we're not going to be afraid to be culturally Black, right? A culturally African, culturally American too, So anyways, I see why that was done. And I respect it in that sense, but I also respect those who also understood that we have to take control of our humanity here. We have to assert it. We have to be who we are. And that notwithstanding what's happening with, our belief in a God who's doing it, but we have to be willing to get out there, right? We put our bodies on the line. And I'm working on an online course right now that will be available by video. I will actually be in a studio and produce this thing with an organization. But one of the aspects of it is talking about the ways in which Black people, for example, have their children were willing to be on the front line, right? This terrible thing called white supremacy and articulated as racism and racial discrimination, racial violence in our world, economic genocide of Black people. I've worked for people who call themselves as justice-oriented, justice-filled people, but they will keep Black women and men from making the money they need to support themselves. I work with people who I thought would have understood the importance of insurance, things like that. But anyway, what I'm saying is children were willing, Black children like Ruby Bridges, were willing to put themselves in harm's way because they believed in their humanity, right? It is not like, we need to be a just society that's working for good. And they wanted to assert their humanity, right? And that's the thing that, again, I'm convinced now that is the most important and empowering thing of who we are as humans, just to be who we are.
Assert our own individual humanity, our own pride in ourselves.
But we are also individuals. And so it's okay to have your hair natural. It's okay, and to embrace it, because one of the early things that Africans were prohibited from doing was embracing their culture, embracing who they are. You cannot express it. You cannot say. It's similar to what we're seeing and happening in Florida right now, right? You don't say gay, right? Anything to silence the people from connecting them so they won't connect to who they are authentically. That is, again, a colonial move. And so with colonial power, and when I say colonial, I mean coming from a power that wants to overtake or invade another group of people, their land, their resources, their bodies, and telling them you cannot express yourselves. So yes, I believe, like many other great thinkers, that one of the defining aspects of democracy in the whole world that we know of is freedom of expression, hands down, And we didn't really dig into womanism, but being a womanist, okay, what I learned to be a womanist around other women in the academy or other educators, Black women who, number one, had challenged feminism. So that was one aspect of it, but also they were willing to be who they were authentically, also claim their cultural identity, right? To do research out of the lived experience of Blackness, of cultural Blackness. And then also to just assert a kind of love, again, but a kind of power that comes from embracing those things about ourselves. And that's what I learned. I was here in Kansas City when I first kind of began to associate myself with being a womanist with Reverend Dr. Emily Towns. She taught here at St. Paul's School of Theology. She's one of the most visible womanists in the country. Now the dean, if she hasn't retired, at Vanderbilt School of Divinity, and others. But she was part of that first generation of womanists in the country. So I learned from her. And one day we were walking out of the cafeteria, and I was kind of walking around her, alongside of her. And I was almost like running to catch up to her. And I was like, Emily, how do you know that you're a womanist? How do you know? And she's like, well, she just stopped. She looked at me and she's like, yeah, it is like this confessional thing. It's like something you come to about yourself. Like womanism as opposed to feminism is not something you're going to learn in school, right? It's something you're going to understand about yourself, who you are. Out of Black culture, there's this term called being womanish. And Alice Walker is also the other one who brought this term to life and said, to be womanish, she gives a 4-part definition in her book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. But to be womanish is to love yourself regardless. I mean, that is like part of the definition, but it's one of the key phrases that I use to order my life. It's to be womanish, to love myself regardless of the cost, regardless of who else doesn't like it, regardless. So for me, that's the heart of it is that love. And when you do that, you're going to be empowered. You're going to feel empowered. You're going to act out of, I guess you could say, again, out of power. So I'm not talking about the goosey feelings we have of love of someone. I'm talking about the empowerment that comes from being loved and from being loving to oneself and to others. And that too is what Gabor Mate talks about. If you really listen to him, for many times, you'll see that he says the reason that people are turning to drugs, alcohol, to their addictions is because they did not get the love they should have gotten as children. And that makes all the difference. Is if you get the first 2 or 3 years right, you're good to go. But when you don't get it later in life, you'll be trying to fill up that space with all these other things.
Well, that was a great summary of how I would understand where you're coming from in your recovery and everything that I've read that you have written. And I think is beautiful. I will also point out to the listeners that if you want to learn about womanism, don't learn it from YouTube.
Yeah, that's right. You have done some work on me.
Do a little reading, Alice Walker.
Yes, do some reading, and plus, you're not going to learn about it in a day. Right?
Okay.
Just because even hearing me, this is good that you've heard me, but there are many womanists in this country, and they've written amazing work, but you won't learn about it on I don't think accurately. So.
No.
Especially because there are lots of critics of what womanism is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to delve into it more because I'm just kind of getting into it. So
yeah,
I'll learn more about it.
Black men, Black people. There are many critics and those who throw shade and even hate toward it. But again, I'm going to keep on loving myself regardless, and that's the thing.
There you go. Well, thank you again. I really have enjoyed this conversation. It's been wonderful. So nice to see you. And I hope we talk again real soon.
Okay. I thank you. And the same from me. The feeling is mutual. Keep on doing what you're doing.
That's another episode of Beyond Belief Sobriety. Thank you for listening. If you would like to support our podcast with recurring monthly contributions, head on over to patreon.com/beyondbeliefsobriety or become a member of our YouTube channel. If you'd like to make a one-time contribution, then visit our website, beyondbeliefsobriety.com, and click on the donate button. I do appreciate your support. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back again real soon with another episode of Beyond Belief Sobriety.